The Villain Press presents The Last Exhibit, a gripping murder mystery novella set on an English country estate. Written by A.D. Hay, read to you by Christopher, an AI synthetic male voice. Chapter 1, Monday, November 4th, 2010, 7 a.m. Steam billowed from the hood of Will Thatcher's silver Ford Focus as it came to a grinding halt in the middle of the narrow one-way lane near the Carmichael estate, northwest of Northampton. The car shuddered once, twice, then gave up, leaving him stranded in the countryside. Ancient oak trees loomed on either side of the lane, casting long shadows across the asphalt, which was still wet from the previous day's deluge. Autumn branches with falling yellow and orange leaves contorted like arthritic fingers against the pewter sky. It was the perfect weather to accompany the disastrous start of his day. Will punched his steering wheel. "Come on, you lazy piece of crap." He threw his body back against his seat and admitted defeat. The soft leather exhaled beneath his weight as he ran his fingers through his greying and thinning light brown hair. Beyond the windscreen, the rolling fields of the Carmichael estate stretched towards the horizon, and morning mist still clung to the hedgerows like gossamer. As he fumbled around for his phone, his smartwatch struck against the armrest. "It's 7:01, good morning," a high-pitched voice said with a giggle from his watch's mini-speaker. Its artificial cheerfulness seemed to taunt his predicament. The late autumn chill had managed to infiltrate his car's interior, causing him to shiver. Just perfect. His car was now more fridge than vehicle. Will gave his navy bomber jacket a final pat down before reaching over to the door handle. "Shit! I'm going to be late!" As he spoke, his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Will pushed the car door open and winced at the crunch of loose gravel on the bitumen beneath his feet. It was the worst sound on earth. He slammed the door behind him as he made his way towards the front of his car. The scent of damp earth and last night's rain filled his nostrils. The dry stone wall that ran parallel to the lane marked the boundary of the Carmichael estate. Its limestone surface was weathered by centuries of Northamptonshire seasons. After he lifted the hot metal, steam gushed out from the engine, momentarily obscuring his view of the car and the empty road that snaked between the ancient trees and pastoral fields. He jumped back out of the steam's path, listening as the sound punctuated the vast quietude of the countryside. A few months earlier, to calm his angry wife, he had agreed to leave his laptop and tablet in the office, and that morning he had left the house without charging his mobile phone, like an idiot. He felt as if the universe were punishing him. Not that he believed in the existence of a deity or any of that New Age nonsense. But there was one thing he was sure of. He would miss the morning meeting with James Lalonde, chief editor of the Northampton Tribune, and an opportunity to trade his assigned story about the Carmichael estate opening to the public for a new art exhibit. A bird trilled somewhere in the distance, its cry piercing the morning stillness, another joyful thing ridiculing his misfortune. In his next life, Will wanted to come back as a bird, squirrel, or another happy creature whose biggest concerns were food and frolicking in the lush green foliage of the English countryside. None of this work nonsense or slaving away for the man. He pulled his smartphone from his front jeans pocket. A sign flashed up on the screen, less than 10% battery. After he dismissed the notification, the words "no signal" screamed at him from the top left-hand corner of the screen. Shit! He glanced around the deserted road. The lane meandered into a thicket of trees, empty in both directions. No one was around, and the only building was the manor house the Carmichael family had owned for the last 100 years. Its slate roof and second-floor mullioned windows were just visible above the tree line. In residence was Lord Carmichael's eldest son, Alistair. He was a pompous arse, and Will's only way of contacting his boss, James Lalonde, and a towing vehicle. Will breathed in the earthy scent of the countryside, then he turned around and trekked towards the eastern gates of the property. His footsteps crunched on the narrow strip of gravel at the road's edge. The path ahead stretched before him like a sentence to be served, each step taking him closer to the inevitable encounter with the aristocrat and his infamous condescending personality. Chapter 2. A sharp rip broke the silence of the tree-lined property as Will Thatcher flung his left leg over the top of the pedestrian gate. Shit. The wrought-iron gate, with its elaborate scrollwork and imposing stone pillars on either side, had seemed manageable from the road. It turned out he was half right. Will didn't just climb the fence. To his embarrassment, he'd spent 10 minutes searching for an intercom, but there wasn't one. So he gave in to his newfound reality of scaling a wall to trespass on private property just to ask for help. Now straddling the massive fortress-like gate, holding on like a middle-aged man desperately clinging to his youth, he must have looked like an idiot. Thankfully, no one was around to witness it. The estate's expansive grounds stretched before him. Its manicured lawns and ancient oaks had witnessed generations of pompous aristocrats strolling beneath their branches. All of it seemed far away from his perch on the gate. He gazed down at his Ralph Lauren jeans and sighed at the long rip forming along the seam. £300 now sacrificed on century-old ironwork. The aristocracy had won again. Morning dew had already soaked through the fabric at his knee, another irritation to add to his growing list of miseries. At 47, he was far too old to be doing anything that resembled parkour. That sort of nonsense was the kind of stunt his teenage son Samuel would pull while with his mates on a Friday afternoon, instead of coming straight home from school. As he peered towards the ground on the other side of the fence, calculating the safest way to dismount, his watch chimed again. It was 14 minutes past 7. The morning briefing would start soon. In his mind, the editorial room materialized. The smell of burnt coffee beans, steam rising from mugs, James shuffling papers at the head of the table. That sound drove Will mad, but he still wanted to be there. If he could just get there, he could offload this mind-numbing art exhibit piece with a casual suggestion. He had the perfect plan. All he had to do was drop a hint in casual conversation. He'd even rehearsed it with his wife the night before. Perhaps Valentine would be better suited for this one, James. She hasn't done enough pieces on her own. But first, he had to survive the estate of the most insufferable man in Northamptonshire. A decorative finial caught his jacket as he shifted his weight. Will lost his balance and plummeted to the ground, landing shoulder first on the gravel. A loud crunch echoed across the grounds. Sharp, never-ending waves of pain poured over his upper body. Will sat up and clutched his shoulder. A tear rolled down his cheek as the pain radiated outward in pulsing waves. Now he'd have to face Alistair injured and vulnerable. The man would probably relish the opportunity to play the magnanimous lord of the manor. He would enjoy helping the lowly journalist in distress. Will could picture it. Alistair's condescending smile, affected concern, and the inevitable anecdote about some ancestor who'd been a field medic at Waterloo. It was unavoidable. Will would miss the morning meeting while listening to Alistair Carmichael drone on and on about his ancestors. After that, he would have to return later that day for part 2 of the lecture and a visit to a pretentiously boring art exhibit. He slowly rose, swallowing back the first signs of nausea. Within the pocket of his bomber jacket, his smartphone buzzed. It was probably at 6% battery by now. The limestone facade of the Carmichael estate towered ahead. Its windows seemed to follow him, like the judging eyes of a village gossip. Somewhere inside was a phone, his saving grace for his disastrous morning, an Alistair Carmichael. Will could picture Alistair sitting on an antique-style sofa, sipping Earl Grey from this family's priceless china collection while reading a financial periodical, like a posh wanker. He limped along the edge of the gravel driveway towards the house. Every step on the gravel felt like a personal affront to his dignity. As a bonus, with each step, a new wave of pain surged through his body, and another tear trickled down his cheek. But the most painful part of this ordeal was the indignity of it all. Having to beg for help from Alistair, all to avoid writing about Alistair. If there were any gods, they had a particularly cruel sense of humour this morning. Chapter 3. The caretaker's cottage was a squat stone thing with a grey-hagged roof that had given up the fight years ago. Its windows had the watchful air of someone determined to keep score. He approached a small set of stone stairs leading towards the side lawn. As he ascended, each step sent fresh daggers of pain through his injured shoulder. A white unmarked panel van with a thin layer of country dust pulled up outside the manor house's front door. The vehicle seemed out of place against the ancient stonework and manicured grounds, like a modern intrusion into a period film. Will sat down on the stairs, clutching his shoulder, out of breath. The pain was officially unbearable. In just a few mere minutes, it had transformed into a deep, throbbing ache that made his vision blur at the edges. As he slumped against the stone wall that separated the caretaker's cottage from the side lawn, Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning chill. Through pain-narrowed eyes, he squinted at two tall men dressed all in black. With their hands encased in thin white cotton gloves, the ones used by professional art handlers, they carried what appeared to be a medium-sized painting with a white linen cloth draped over both sides. Their movements seemed efficient and practiced. Something was unsettling about it. They were almost too smooth, too silent for country manor house staff. The men slid the artwork into the van with the careful precision of those accustomed to handling valuable objects, then turned around and disappeared into the house. Not a single word was exchanged between them. Now, that was odd. What two people don't even have a bit of banter between them as they work? The scene nagged at Will, momentarily pushing the pain to the periphery of his consciousness. Within the next few weeks, the Carmichael art exhibit was scheduled to open to the public. New acquisitions should be arriving, not departing. Even if a piece needed a minor repair, it wouldn't be leaving, not today, because Alistair was expecting a journalist from the Northampton Tribune to interview him. It was a pivotal piece in his PR machine, gearing up for the estate's grand reopening to the public. Will winced as he pulled his phone from his jeans pocket, the movement sending another hot spike of pain through his shoulder. He clicked the home button, less than 5% battery. The screen's glow illuminated his ashen face. Sweat trickled down his brow. His finger hovered over the sleep button, but there was still no signal, just his luck. Despite the overwhelming feeling of pain, he couldn't just sit there, like a lump. There was a part of him that had to know what was in that van. Old reporter instincts, old being the operative word. He dragged his weary frame off the stairs towards the white van. Will glanced around the immaculate grounds. The place was deserted. There were no gardeners tending the exquisite hedges and shrubs, or security patrolling the perimeter. Absent was Alistair's infamous groundskeeper, who was known to chase away trespassers with colourful language and the occasional brandishing of a trowel. He crept towards the front of the truck. Quite surprisingly, the driver's seat was empty. Keys dangled in the ignition. It was as if the owner didn't have a care in the world and had no notion of the possibility of vehicle theft. Perhaps the lack of people on the estate gave the driver a false sense of security. But they were transporting art. Another wave of pain rushed over his body as he leaned against the van's cool metal surface for support. A soft groan escaped his lips. Everything within him wanted to drag himself towards the house and call for help. His rational mind screamed at him to seek assistance for his injury, to find a phone, and stop this foolish investigation. But another part of him, that more curious part, the part that had once kept him up for 72 hours straight to break a story on local government corruption, needed to look under that white linen cloth. Besides, his boss, James Lalonde, would approve. He was the poster child for looking for trouble. What's the worst that could happen? The van's back doors were open, beckoning like an open house invitation, drawing in nosy neighbours. Will shuffled along the vehicle's length towards the open back door. His injured shoulder brushed against the metal panelling, sending jolts of pain that made his teeth clench. The van's interior was dim. It smelt of new carpet and something else. Oil paint and old canvas. With his good arm, Will lifted the white sheet to reveal the edge of the painting. In front of him was a small section of a vibrant yellow canvas, with that unmistakable brushwork that any art lover would recognize. His heart quickened. This was no ordinary artwork. As he threw back the entire blanket to unveil the masterpiece, he gasped. It was breathtaking. The swirling brushstrokes of blue added a sense of depression to the piece, which outshone the yellow in the corner. This was a work he'd only seen replicated in art history books or in a museum, never up close, not even in his wildest dreams. Will loved art and had always been drawn to it like a moth to a flame. As an aspiring artist in his younger days, when he'd lived in a small studio flat in Covent Garden, with paint-stained fingers and boundless ambition before journalism claimed him, he'd spent his free time wandering the many art galleries in London. He could still recall the hushed reverence of those spaces, the way certain paintings seemed to speak to him across centuries. Once again his curiosity got the better of him. He slipped his phone out of his pocket and slid his index finger along the screen to access the camera app. "Wait!" The rest of his sentence died in his throat as something smooth and strong wrapped around it from behind. A thick rope tightened with shocking speed. cutting off his words and breath in one efficient movement. His phone clattered from his grip. It struck the van's edge, and the screen cracked as it continued its journey towards the gravel, landing face up at his feet. As he started to choke, his good hand flung up to claw at the garrote. He caught a glimpse of his attacker. In the darkened, shattered screen of his fallen smartphone, like a modern Medusa's mirror, Will stared into the eyes of his attacker. He kicked it with his feet and listened as it slid across the gravel. A nearby shrub rustled its leaves as his phone found its final resting place. The world around him blackened. This was the end. No one was around to rescue him. Chapter 4. 2 p.m. A glug, glug, glug. The rattling of fine bone china, and the hum of an outdoor radiator fighting the afternoon autumn chill, was the odd little symphony that accompanied James as he sat back in the cushions of the outdoor furniture in Alistair Carmichael's private garden. The estate manager, Julian Noble, wearing a tailored trouser suit and a pale blue button-up shirt, hovered awkwardly in the background between a tall, wiry man and a petite blonde maid. Alistair's small private army stood at attention, waiting to be dismissed. It was not how James planned to spend his afternoon. A queasy feeling had settled in his gut ever since Will Thatcher failed to arrive that morning, and it wouldn't dissipate. He had a long list of tasks to achieve as the editor of the Northampton Tribune, and he had to add having an afternoon tea with a tour of Alistair's private art collection before it opened to the public, and dealing with a missing journalist to that list. And he had to write an article on said art collection, all under the watchful eye of Harry Lancaster, who just happened to be acquainted with Alistair. Harry's suggestion for a piece in the culture section was more of a polite demand. James knew he should be delighted by the prospect of a break from his desk, but said hiatus came with a price tag. "Alistair, if you need me for anything, I'll be working in the library," Julia said as she flipped her shoulder-length auburn hair back. Then she marched towards the French doors. Her posture was rigid, almost too perfect, as though she were balancing invisible books on her head. "Oh, and Hans," Julia paused and looked over her shoulder. "Be a dear and bring a pot of tea to the library." Julia smiled as she continued on her journey. As Julia turned to leave, her eyes met Hans's for the briefest moment. The butler's right eyebrow arched a fraction, and Julia's lips tightened before she continued on her way. Something passed between them. A message James couldn't read. It must be about Alistair. Either that, or he broke some unspoken rule of British etiquette, or maybe it was just his accent. James nodded to the wiry older man who had finished pouring his tea and picked up the cup. One sip confirmed it. Disgusting. "It's Earl Grey, sir," he said with a faint hint of a European accent. James placed the delicate, fine-boned china cup back on its saucer. Behind the butler's bland expression, James detected a flicker of judgment. "I'm surprised that you didn't send one of your minions here," Alistair said with a smirk, his fingers drumming against the armrest. "Yes, Will Thatcher would have been the better choice, but art is not unfamiliar to me. My grandparents dragged me around the Louvre when they weren't taking me on day trips to Chateau," James said with a faint smile on his lips. "Sounds like an ideal childhood," Alistair said, examined his signet ring. "Not when you're 5. James pushed his black-rimmed glasses up towards the bridge of his nose, the familiar gesture buying him a moment to study Alistair's demeanour. "I hope Will is okay." There was something in Alistair's concern that seemed performative, like a bored actor reciting lines during a long drawn-out rehearsal. "Something came up. It's not a big deal," James lied as he shuffled around in his seat. The weight of his concern for Will pressed down on him. Not showing up to work wasn't something Will would do. Even when he was sick, Will would work from home and still get his stories in on time. He was the most reliable of all his journalists. Alistair cleared his throat. "You know, this morning I had to call a tow truck to remove some old wreck of a car off the road near my gates. It was a ghastly thing. People aren't as reliable as they used to be." Alistair took a sip of his tea. Just perfect. He was trapped in a never-ending barrage of small talk. James ran his hands through his thick, dark blonde hair as he watched Valentine's name flash up on his screen for the 4th time that day. He took a deep breath, then picked up the teacup from its saucer and took a long drink while staring at the manicured hedges that stood in precise formation. Their shadows stretched across the ever-expanding lawn in the fading afternoon light. "I don't see a wedding ring, so I'll assume that she's your girlfriend and is keeping tabs on you." Alistair's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. James rolled his eyes. "She means well." He took another deep breath, resisting the urge to recheck his phone for messages from Will. I got a divorce recently, and I have to admit that I don't miss the nagging or the phone calls, but then again, sometimes I do, Alistair said as he clutched his teacup. Women are almost like a drug. You know it's not good for you, but you take it anyway. That's cynical, sir, the wiry man in a suit said as he walked over to the table. As he reached forward and poured Alistair another cup of tea, a slight hint of a silver cufflink protruded from under his suit jacket. The man wore a dress shirt that required cufflinks to pour tea. It must have been quite restrictive. He studied Hans for a moment. His movements were precise, as if they were practiced over decades of service. But there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been visible before. He must be a fan of Alistair's former wife. "None for me," James said, covering the top of his teacup with his hand as the tall gentleman swung the teapot spout in his direction. The liquid inside seemed too dark, almost black in the afternoon light, which meant it was too strong to drink, even more so than before. "Oh, this is my butler, Hans," Alistair said as he gestured towards the tall, thin man in his 60s. "He speaks 5 languages, Dutch, English, German, Spanish, and he can even speak with you in French if you like." "Are you from the Netherlands?" James asked with an awkward smile. Hans's eyes narrowed at the question. "Yes," Hans raised his eyebrows at James. "I haven't lived there since I was a boy, but I go back often." Hans walked back to the silver cart and placed the teapot down. His hands trembled, but he still managed to move with a surprising deftness. "Hans was my key advisor for the estate's latest art acquisition," Alistair said, as he raised his teacup to Hans. "He has quite the eye for authenticity and value." There was something proprietary in Alistair's tone, as though Hans were another possession rather than a person. Working for Alistair must be a barrel of laughs. Poor guy, this was how he was spending his retirement years. "Is this new acquisition included in the public gallery?" James placed his teacup on its saucer, then swiped his index finger across the screen of his smartphone and opened the recording app. "Do you mind?" James smiled at Alistair and pointed towards the red button. "Go ahead." Alistair waved at James's smartphone with the casual indifference of someone accustomed to being recorded and photographed. James started the recording. "Yes, it's often referred to in French as l'homme est en mer," Alistair said, his pronunciation flawless, rehearsed even, as though he'd been practicing. It was almost better than James's, but not quite. "Are you trying to tell me you have a Van Gogh resting on your walls with next to no security?" James asked as he leaned over the garden table towards Alistair. In his peripheral vision he caught Hans straightening his posture, a subtle shift that somehow commanded attention. "I have security," Alistair said with a laugh as he lays back in his chair. The sunlight caught the edges of his signet ring as he gestured dismissively. "No offence, Hans," James said as he pointed towards the butler, "but a man in his 60s is not security team. Look, I'm not just a posh brat who sits around drinking expensive teas, wearing cashmere and drinking gin by night. This is my home. I actually live here. It's not a museum. With that in mind, I've hired 100 extra staff members, some of whom are security." Alistair's voice took on a defensive edge. It had a thinness that hinted to James that his remark had struck closer to home than the aristocrat cared to admit. "And I'm a well-respected archaeologist in my field, so I do know what I'm doing. Do you even know who I am? Did you do any research, Mr. Lalonde?" As Alistair spoke, he kept his voice low and his pace slow. It was as if he were attempting to keep his temper at bay. Something heavy formed in the pit of James's stomach as he listened to Alistair discuss his security details. The casual way Alistair spoke about protecting a priceless masterpiece struck James as either dangerously naive or perhaps intentionally misleading. What would an archaeologist know about security? If he were a museum curator, like his ex-wife, that would be different. The interesting thing about his ex-wife was that her name seemed to have been deleted from all articles, websites, biographies, and even Wikipedia, but her job title was still shown. Someone had done a digital purge. The divorce must be far from amicable, judging solely by the PR work alone. It must have cost a small fortune. James fought the urge to roll his eyes. "Yes, Alistair, I know exactly who you are. My grandfather is a massive fan of your work and has read all of your books, so I'm well informed. I'm just asking because there's hardly any staff around. I'm merely concerned." Alistair didn't respond. For a brief moment there was a flicker of something, but the man's mask remained in place for now. It was as if he were picking a fight, possibly out of boredom. The aristocrat picked up his teacup and took another sip. James took a few moments to centre himself. "So you're the private buyer from the auction back in February," James said. "I remember it was all Will would talk about." He went on and on about the before-premium sale price. The mere mention of Will's name hung in the air like an echo in an empty room. James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with Will, but it had to be nothing more than paranoia. He must be interviewing with another paper. Mad. Yeah, the premium was steep, but that's what you get with an art auction in London. I was prepared to go higher than 14 million. Alistair's knuckles whitened as he took another sip of his tea. "And I personally verified the provenance documentation." Alistair paused, then waved dismissively. "Oh, sorry, you probably don't know what that is. It's the papers that come with art pieces, especially historical ones. You can't entrust that kind of work to just anyone. Some colleagues have questionable methods. Sure, it's a far cry from my usual pond of pre-Galfridian Arthurian legend and early medieval Britain, but I'm no fool." Hans shifted his weight as his gaze fixed on a point in the distance, as though recalling something important. That must be how he coped with working for Alistair. He was off with the fairies, thinking of more important things. Before James could stop himself, his hand moved towards his pocket. He needed a cigarette. Behind him, the French doors beckoned as James plotted his escape from the world's most excruciating conversation. While towering in the background, Hans's stare bore into him. It was like Hans had sensed James's plans and wasn't going to let him leave until the interview was over. Perhaps Alistair's dedication to protecting his priceless art piece went deeper than appearances suggested, and Hans was security disguised as a butler. For a moment, James felt less like a guest and more like an intruder who had stumbled into a museum after hours and had just been caught by the night shift guard. Chapter 5. It was a typical grey autumn day as James stepped out of the front door of the stately home and lit a cigarette. He peered up at the grey clouds, typical English weather. To be honest, France wasn't any better. The weather patterns were almost identical. A chill hung in the breeze, cutting through his suit jacket. Relief washed over him as he inhaled. The familiar burn filled his lungs. He exhaled and watched the smoke drift upward. Above him, the grand estate stretched towards the clouds. The most striking thing about the house was its exterior. Considering its age, the facade was clean, a far cry from the soot-stained limestone buildings that lined France's capital. It must be a massive money pit. A subtle tingling feeling swept over him and settled in the pit of his stomach. Someone was watching him. It was bound to happen. On this side of the channel, James's favourite pastime was often met with disdain. In France, no one would blink twice at smoking over a pristine lawn. Over his shoulder, far off in the back of the grand foyer, Hans snarled at him. The butler's tall, wiry frame was eerily still. His pale green eyes narrowed to slits, like an angry cat moments away from lashing out with its long, sharp claws, minus the arched back and the hissing. The smoke had drifted into the house. It was a reaction he had grown accustomed to since arriving in Oxford to study for his undergraduate degree at All Saints. Over the last few years, James had attempted to give up, but the pressures of his job drove him back. But he promised Valentine that he would give it up, so he had to keep trying. "Out of respect for the artwork, I must ask you to refrain from smoking," Hans snapped, his Dutch accent more pronounced in his irritation. There was something in his tone, a concern that seemed excessive for an employee. "Calm down, Hans. I wasn't going to smoke inside." James shook his head and walked towards the side lawn, continuing his stress-relieving ritual, while overlooking the thick hedges and lush garden. It was November, and the garden was still green, a feat James didn't believe was possible. The unnatural perfection of the landscape was like a manufactured personality, created by an overpaid PR agent, and so was the tour and the entire afternoon. Something was off, though James couldn't put his finger on it. Maybe that was why Will had conveniently disappeared. As he continued to smoke, he reached into the pocket of his grey suit and pulled out his smartphone. It was 29 minutes past 2 in the afternoon. He wanted to get out of that place and return to his desk. If the afternoon continued the way it was, he would be at his desk past midnight, and he knew how Valentine felt about that bad habit. Merde. Knowing his luck, DCI Anwar Khan would probably stop by with some cutting remark about James working late again. Anwar had a habit of dropping by the Tribune after hours, asking vague questions about non-existent cases, when in reality he was there to press James about his workaholic tendencies. The last thing he needed was another lecture about work-life balance, especially when it came from a man who ought to take his own advice. He tapped the blackened screen of his phone and waited for the clock app to open, then set a timer for 3:15. Hopefully, by then, the tour would be over, and he would have seen the van go. Over tea, Alistair had said Hans was his key advisor, and he'd somehow convinced Alistair it was worth the investment. The butler's art history knowledge was oddly extensive. His passion for the painting, purely based on his cigarette break interaction, seemed personal. Perhaps there was more to the man than his starched uniform suggested. Hans might have an art history degree for all James knew. After he slipped the phone back into the inside pocket of his grey suit jacket, his eye caught a glimmer of silver from inside the bushes. He hesitated, glancing back towards the house. In the library, Julia Noble sat on a sofa. Light bounced off her auburn hair as she bent over her laptop. Her earlier efficiency had been impressive, but there was an edge to her politeness towards Hans and Alistair that suggested they had a complicated working relationship. No one else was around. Perhaps he was being unfair and reading way too much into Hans and Julia's behaviour. James crept closer. A surge of adrenaline rushed through his body as he peered into the hedge. It turned out the flicker of metal wasn't the shrubbery's only secret. Chapter 6. James flung his head back, stiffened his posture, and gasped. Oh, merd. A wave of nausea crashed over him as his cigarette fell to the ground. The still-burning tip hissed against the damp grass, sending up a thin wisp of smoke. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out the distant sounds of the estate. Bending down, James picked up the cigarette. He scanned the grounds of the stately home. Not a single soul was in sight. Thankfully, no one had witnessed him almost setting the shrub alight. The lush, green lawns stretched empty in all directions. Its manicured topiaries stood like the Silent Queen's guards at Buckingham Palace. The hum of a vacuum cleaner came from somewhere above him on the first floor of the house, and Julia was still hunched over her laptop in the library. The mundane normalcy of these activities felt surreal, almost obscene, in light of his discovery. His hand shook as he took a deep breath and stepped closer to the hedge. With his cigarette dangling from the fingers of his left hand, James leaned over. Reaching out, he ran his finger along the smooth, silky surface of the tiny green leaves. The branches parted. Below, a familiar navy bomber jacket clung to the thin frame of a body lying face down, sheltered by the lush green hedge of the side lawn. James could recognize that jacket anywhere. It was Will Thatcher. He wore that jacket all year round. Even in summer, Will refused to part with it, claiming it was lucky. The memory sliced through James with painful clarity. All of James's regular workday interactions with Will flooded his mind. On Friday, he found Will dabbing frantically at a stain on his lucky jacket, while cursing colourfully enough to make Valentine blush as she made a baguette sandwich in the kitchen beside him. This run-of-the-mill memory was now precious, a final glimpse of a life abruptly ended. He would never find him in the kitchen again. Will hadn't missed the meeting because he overslept. He hadn't quit without notice or was interviewing at a rival paper. Here he was, thrown into a hedge on the Carmichael estate. One of Will's arms was twisted beneath him, fingers curled as if still grasping for something. His right shoulder was positioned at a grotesque angle beneath his jacket's fabric. It was dislocated, evidence of a painful fall or violent battle before death. A thin trickle of dried blood had carved a path from beneath his head, staining the impeccable lawn with a burgundy streak. Just beyond Will's outstretched hand, partially hidden beneath a cluster of leaves, lay a smartphone with a shattered screen. It seemed to have been kicked or thrown into the bushes and was too far from the body to have fallen from his pocket. His final moments must have been violent and painful. No one deserved to die like that. It appeared as if someone had just placed Will in the hedgerow rather than him falling during an argument. Someone had tucked him away like a shameful secret. James stepped back from the hedge, his hand still clutching his phone. This was no accident. Then it dawned on him. The wrecked car mentioned by Alistair must have been Will's silver Ford Focus. Will's car must have broken down. This meant he had to walk to the grand manor house. Somehow he dislocated his shoulder, possibly from a fall from a great height. Was he pushed out of a window? Maybe Hans let him inside to phone for help, then Will might have walked in on something he wasn't supposed to see and was pushed. Julia and Hans might be up to something. That could explain the look they exchanged earlier, but there's Alistair. He could be involved. Then again, Alistair seemed like too much of a pretentious aristocrat to do something like this. Even picturing him on a dig site getting his hands dirty was hard to imagine. Perhaps he might have asked Hans to get rid of Will. That was wild. The truth was probably far simpler. James pulled out his smartphone. At the top left-hand corner of the screen, the words "no signal" cried out to him. Chapter 7. Moments later, a cold hand grabbed James by the shoulder. The touch was like ice, tearing through his suit jacket, sending an involuntary shudder down his spine. He jerked away as his heart raced. Someone within the stately home had watched him discover Will. At the time, it seemed ridiculous considering there appeared to be a bare-bones level of staffing. But he was wrong, and had to remain calm. The last thing he needed was to panic and make decisions from that emotional state. Nothing good would come from that. The cold hand gripped his shoulder a little harder than before and yanked his body around. "Let's get on with the tour, shall we?" Alistair said with a cheery disposition. His smile was broad and gleaming, but it didn't reach his eyes. It was just Alistair, and he was utterly oblivious to James's discovery. Over Alistair's shoulder, James saw Hans standing by the side of the house, with a cold expression, clutching an ashtray. The butler's tall frame blocked the path back to the hedge, like a traffic bobby, his posture rigid and imposing. The early afternoon sun cast Hans's shadow across the lawn. It stretched towards the very spot where Will lay. I... James said, as Alistair grabbed James's arm, then dragged him down the path along the side of the house towards the entrance. Alistair's grip was surprisingly firm. His manicured fingernails dug into James's bicep through the fabric of his suit. The casual control in the gesture felt more like a warning than friendly guidance. Perhaps his theory about Will being pushed out of the window and shoved into the hedge wasn't that far-fetched. Hans thrust the cigarette tray in James's face with a grunt. His cold, pale green eyes glared back at him. Those eyes seemed to pierce through James as if they were searching for any hint of what he'd seen, or what he knew. But it was probably his overactive imagination, a result of the fright he got when Alistair crept up behind him and the panic that followed. Hans was likely annoyed by the cigarette smoke making its way into the house and damaging the antiques, making his job a little more difficult than necessary. With another grunt, Hans inched the tray forward, a little closer than before. His patience was wearing thin. James dropped the cigarette into the crystal ashtray. To his surprise, Hans's stern expression softened as he gave a slight, almost approving nod, the way someone would acknowledge a puppy that finally obeyed a command. All that was missing was every good pet owner's favourite phrase, "Who's a good boy?" Alistair continued to babble about his artistic influences and favourite painters as he herded James through the house, away from the evidence. Alistair's words flowed with a practised charm that sounded hollow and rehearsed as James peered over his shoulder, past Hans's towering figure, towards the side lawn. From this point, the hedge looked quite innocent. Its manicured perfection revealed nothing of the grim reality it concealed. As James followed along, the weight of his phone in his pocket felt heavier than before. After all, it was his only connection to the outside world, to potential help, but it had no signal. Perhaps he could check his phone for a signal during the tour, slip into a side room and call for help. Hopefully that would be possible, but James suspected he would remain under Hans's watchful eye the entire time. Chapter 8. A crick formed in James's neck as he stood in the grand hall looking up at one of the many portraits of Alistair's relatives. The tour was a snooze fest. He couldn't take his mind off Will, and it was impossible to interrupt the rehearsed lecture on history, art and genealogy. Alistair stood beside him, continuing the monologue he had started the moment he grabbed James's arm and dragged him inside. The aristocrat rattled off what must have been hundreds of tours' worth of family history. To James's surprise, Hans had disappeared and was no longer stalking them down the hall. His sudden departure left James feeling exposed, like he'd lost track of a predator in tall grass. "Now, this is my great-great-great-great-grandfather," Alistair exclaimed. Next, he transitioned into a lecture on the portrait's historical context that wasn't just informative, but seemed designed to emphasize his intellectual superiority. not to mention bore every guest who walked the halls to tears. Every time James attempted to interject, Alistair redirected the conversation back to his lecture, as if he were desperate to maintain control of the tour. Growing tired of the lecture, James studied the intricate brushwork in the next painting, and that is his wife. The painted figures inspected James with cold, judgmental eyes that seemed to follow him as he moved. Their aristocratic features bore the same haughty confidence that Alistair himself exuded, generations of entitlement captured in oils and gilt frames. It must be a genetic thing. Alistair turned around, walked down the hall, and stopped by another portrait. 15 minutes had passed since James first stepped into the grand hall, and he still had not seen the van go, and he was about to look at another portrait that looked the same as all the others. But that was the least of his problems. His senior journalist was lying face down in a hedge, and no one seemed to care or even wonder what he was doing on the side lawn. Every second spent staring at ancient Carmichaels was another second Will lay undiscovered. Another second evidence could be tampered with or removed entirely, and what was he going to say to Will's wife? James followed Alistair down the hall. Alistair. There'll be time for questions at the end, Alistair said with a casualness that didn't quite match his museum curator-style movements. I've organised the tour, and I don't want to fall behind schedule. James rolled his eyes, then took a deep breath in through his nose as the Art 101 monologue continued. His footsteps echoed across the polished parquet floor. The overhead lighting glimmered across the neat and orderly glossy boards. He paused and stared out the window, down the road that led to the eastern gate. The hall grew quiet. James spun around and stalked after Alistair, who was a metre away. While James was here, he had to press Alistair about the real reason behind his purchase. There had to be something more to it other than his butler's recommendation. Sorry, I got a little distracted by the grounds, James said with his hands in his pockets. Alistair sighed. Very well, I can start again. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face, but was soon masked by a polite smile. I've been wondering. James straightened his shoulders. What made you take a £14 million risk? The aristocrat's posture shifted as he whirled around, tilted his head to the side, and narrowed his eyes. Alistair did a perfect imitation of a confused puppy, one of those family pets that would let in burglars, but he was anything but stupid. It's an expensive purchase. Why that painting? James asked, continuing to watch Alistair's reaction. Art is a long-term investment. It's hardly a risk, Alistair said over his shoulder. Like archaeology, it's about patience and recognizing value where others see only dirt. Something in the way he articulated this suggested he applied this methodical approach to more than just artifacts. He adjusted his signet ring, rotating it once, then a second time. It's what you want to see. Follow me. Together they walked to the end of the hall, surveying the paintings as they went along. James's footsteps echoed off the vaulted ceiling, creating a strange percussion punctuating the silence between Alistair's rehearsed babble. For some reason, he was struggling to muster up the courage to say something. It was embarrassing. He was letting poor Will down. You know, I carefully rearranged the paintings to form a build-up to the Van Gogh. It was Julia's idea. His voice carried a note of pride that seemed excessive for someone merely following an employee's suggestion. James stopped opposite another portrait. He raised his eyebrows and continued to stroll down the hall, trying to keep his mind on the task at hand and play it cool. But he couldn't get his mind off Will. The image of Will's broken body kept superimposing itself over the aristocratic faces staring down from their frames, a macabre slideshow playing behind his eyes. To answer your question, Hans is an art history buff, and convinced me it was worth the investment. Art can be a little risky sometimes, but this painting was worth it. And once Julia found out I was interested in the painting, she went into research mode and came up with the idea for the gallery. Alistair's hand gestured expansively, but his eyes remained fixed on James like a bright white spotlight shining on a lone actor on a bare stage. They both sound a little overqualified for house staff, James said, attempting to keep his tone light rather than accusatory. Well, yes, my father hired both Hans and Julia. I kept them on. Hans does a lot of research for me and my business partner, Maximilian Nichols, and Julia manages the estate. The art exhibit falls under it, so it's her task, Alistair said, as he stopped opposite another painting. He spoke with the air of someone who had inherited possessions rather than employees, people who came with the property like fixtures and fittings. Through the tall, floor-to-ceiling sash windows, James had a partial view of the side lawn, and the hedge where Will lay was just visible. The thick velvet-like curtains were pinned back, creating a perfect frame for the pristine green grass, trees and hedges, which seemed to mock him. "Just down here is what you've been dying to see." Alistair's voice trailed off as he got farther away. His expensive loafers made no sound on the parquet as he moved ahead, expecting James to follow along without question. James took a deep breath to centre himself and turned around to find the hall empty. "Alistair," he called out as his heart raced. But there was no answer. The empty hall stretched before him. Portraits of generations of Carmichaels hung above him, watching like a disapproving teacher on a school outing, about to scold a child who had hung too far back from the group. He turned around and sprinted down the hall and around the corner to find Alistair staring up at a blank space on the wall. A lone picture hook lay in the centre of the empty spot, which was free from dust. It stood out like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. "I thought something had happened to you." The words came out more breathless than James intended. He must have sounded like a panicked lunatic. Alistair raised his eyebrows at James. "Like what?" he asked with a pinched expression. His tone was almost challenging, as though daring James to voice his suspicions. "Don't be alarmed, but there's a body in one of your hedges on the side lawn," James said as Alistair ran down the hall, looking up at the artwork. The words felt surreal as they left his mouth, but Alistair was too absorbed in his own drama to listen. "Sorry, some jokester has moved the Van Gogh," Alistair said as he opened a nearby door and walked through. "Julia?" His voice betrayed more concern for the missing painting than for the news of a corpse on his property, the priorities of a man whose world revolved around possessions rather than people. James ran down the hall and into the room after Alistair. His mind struggled to process Alistair's non-reaction to his bombshell announcement. It was as though the man hadn't heard him at all, or, worse, didn't care. The room was almost empty. A thick layer of dust covered the white linens that were draped over the furniture. Unlike the polished hallway, no one had cleaned this room in months. Alistair rubbed the back of his neck as he scanned the room. His eyes darted from corner to corner. A few moments later, he threw his hands in the air and admitted defeat. "It's gone," he whimpered. His voice cracked, the first genuine emotion James had heard from him all afternoon. "My painting has disappeared," he cried, his hands trembling as they gripped the doorframe. "Perfect. I'm going to be known as the archaeologist who lost a priceless piece of history. I know you're under a lot of stress, but Will Thatcher was murdered and tossed into one of your hedges," James said, as he pointed towards the open doorway. He emphasized each word, watching Alistair's face for any hint of recognition, surprise, or, most tellingly, lack of surprise. But all Alistair did was stare and murmur. It was all about the painting for him. After all, he was missing £14 million. "We kept the artwork in here," Alistair said, wide-eyed. His voice rose in pitch, taking on a childish quality that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Alistair's distress over the missing Van Gogh seemed too genuine to be an act. James had unfairly judged him. What seemed like a calculated disregard for Will's death was the self-absorbed panic of a collector who was robbed of his prized possession. The truth was, Alistair wasn't capable of such a meticulous and violent act. He lacked the motive, attention span, and cunning required to do something like that. His concerns were too shallow, tied to status and appearances. No, Alistair wasn't behind Will's death, but he might unwittingly be connected to whoever was. "Alistair," James said, "I believe Will might have stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen, and on that same day someone stole your Van Gogh. Doesn't this seem a bit too coincidental to you?" Chapter 9. James stood, looking in horror at the scene that lay before him. It had taken him almost 15 minutes to reason with Alistair. He had dragged the now paranoid aristocrat outside the manor house and around to the side garden. The hedge stood before them, its manicured perfection restored as though nothing had ever disturbed it. Mid-autumn sun hung low in the sky, already beginning its early November descent. Its pale glow gave the manicured grounds a cold, unsettling quality. Somewhere within the forest that lined the vast property, a crow called out, its harsh cry breaking the unnatural silence that had settled over the garden. Alistair crept up behind him and leaned over the hedge, His expensive cologne, something woody and pretentious, invaded James's personal space. The aristocrat's breathing was shallow and quick, betraying a nervousness that was out of step with his usual haughty demeanour. James pointed at the dark liquid splattered over the small green leaves. "I swear Will was lying right here," he said, as he ran his fingers through his hair and glanced around the side lawn. The blood had already begun to darken, turning from vivid crimson to a rusty brown that would soon be indistinguishable from the green leaves' natural colour. "I believe you," Alistair said in a hushed tone as he continued to stare at the green shrubbery. His pale face had taken on a greenish tinge. "I can't believe this sort of thing has happened at my ancestral home. It's utterly deplorable," he added, as though a murder were a breach of estate etiquette. "I should have done something earlier," James muttered as he surveyed the ever-expanding grounds of the Carmichael estate. Knowing his luck, Will's body would be long gone by now. Guilt settled heavily in his chest. He had wasted precious time listening to Alistair babble on about his ancestors, while Will's killer had disposed of the evidence. The grounds offered countless places to hide a body. It had 3 buildings in the centre of the estate, along with multiple manicured gardens and a surrounding woodland. There was even a private island with a mausoleum where the Carmichael's ancestors were laid to rest. It was a murderer's paradise. James crouched down and examined the soil. The print of Will's body remained in the soft earth, similar to a ghostly outline of a chalk drawing at a crime scene. But it was already fading as the ground settled. Soon the ground would dry and all traces that Will was here would disappear. Scanning the hedge's bed of soil, James searched for the shattered phone that he'd seen earlier. It was gone too. Whoever had moved Will had been thorough enough to collect the device. So it must have been Will's. The phone could have contained photos or messages of Will's final moments before his untimely death. Or maybe he was wrong, and the smartphone belonged to the killer. Whoever it was realized their mistake and came back to clean up. So perhaps in some way they were more methodical than he first imagined. As a bead of sweat dripped down his face, James spotted a trail of tousled gravel leading towards the back of the house. The neat beige stones had been disturbed in a pattern too consistent to be accidental, creating a trail about 40 centimetres wide. He crept down the side of the house, looking down at the small pebbles. The rocks appeared to have been making way for something heavy, possibly a body, which meant Will had been dragged along the path, but that would leave too much evidence behind. It could have been a wheelbarrow with a body, and someone dragging their feet, struggling with the weight. The knot in his stomach tightened as he contemplated how the scenario might have played out. Then he saw it. A dark, crimson smear. It wasn't just blood, but other bodily fluids, so Will was dragged after all. James had seen enough crime scenes to recognise the signs of death's undignified aftermath. Apart from removing the shattered smartphone, the killer hadn't bothered to be careful while moving the body. They were either rushed, panicking, or arrogantly confident in their ability to clean up afterwards. But they ran out of time. "Whatever you do, don't move," he called over his shoulder to Alistair. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, too calm, too measured for the horror unfolding before him. The trail of blood and bodily fluids created a path that led around to the back of the house. It glistened against the pale stones and was still wet in places, tacky and half-dried in others. This meant that Will had been moved out of the hedge quite recently. The sound of stones crunching underfoot filled the quiet side lawn, breaking James's concentration. "Be careful not to disturb the evidence," James said over his shoulder. He turned to find Alistair stepping onto the trail, expensive Italian loafers pressing into the bloody gravel. "You've just stepped in some blood." Alistair stepped back, his face contorted in disgust as he noticed the stain on the sole of his shoe. He stared at it with more apparent concern than he'd shown for Will's death. "This is all rather unseemly," he muttered, as though inconvenienced by an uninvited guest turning up to a dinner party. I'll call the police," Alistair said, pointing at the house. Then he turned and sprinted away. His lanky figure dashed towards the house with surprising speed for someone who, up until now, had seemed so measured in his movements. James turned to the bloody trail. Whoever stole the painting might have panicked and moved the body. They were probably watching from somewhere within the house, saw him peering into the shrubbery, then moved Will. The path was too obvious, too sloppy for someone who had carefully concealed a Van Gogh theft. Professional art thieves wouldn't leave such a trail. More disturbingly, multiple individuals could be involved. The careful art thieves, the killer, and whoever moved Will's body might not be the same people. Also, there was no evidence suggesting that the killer had left with the body, but it was odd that someone would drag a body behind the house and not towards a garage. There was an entire forest surrounding the Carmichael estate, or that miniature island, two perfect locations where a body would lie undiscovered. Either way, someone had dragged Will's body away and disposed of it like he was refuse on bin day. This wasn't just evidence disappearing, it was his colleague and friend. Will had a wife and 2 teenage children. He mattered to people. James pulled out his smartphone again, hoping against hope for a signal. Still nothing. He was alone with this, at least until Alistair called the police, if that was what he was doing. The stately home's limestone facade took on an ominous quality as the afternoon light faded. Hans was likely still inside, and Julia too. Either could have moved Will's body while he was distracted with Alistair's art tour, but why would they do such a thing? Perhaps it was another member of staff lurking in the shadows so far unseen. Chapter 10. Crunch. The beige gravel stones gave way under James's brown leather boots as he walked towards the hedge. A honey-yellow light from the late afternoon sun had crept across the gravel drive, highlighting the spot in the hedge where Will's body had been. The cold wind continued to blow across the beautiful English garden, carrying the metallic scent of blood that seemed to linger despite the body's removal. He clenched the sides of his grey suit jacket with both hands, drew them closer to his body and hunched over. A series of worst-case scenarios flashed through James's mind as he recalled his findings from earlier that day. Then it dawned on him the grounds were tranquil, almost too tranquil. Birds perched in the nearby trees had stopped singing. All that remained was the whisper of wind through the hedgerows and the distant tick of a grandfather clock from somewhere inside the house. Through the ground-floor window, a maid dusted the library's bookshelves, blissfully unaware of the events that had unfolded mere meters away. The maid's head bounced from side to side as if she were listening to a tune, but she had no headphones and there was no music coming from within the house. She swept the feather duster across the leather-bound volumes that probably hadn't been read in decades. Even though Alistair was an archaeologist and studied for many years, James struggled to see him in the library with anything but a scotch in hand. On her left were the open double doors of the library. Through them, the round table in the grand foyer was visible, but no other members of staff could be seen wandering around. It was just the maid. She continued to dust, pausing every now and then to adjust a book. Maybe her obliviousness was genuine and not a performance, as his inner skeptic wanted to believe. Alistair must have decided not to use the phone in the foyer and go somewhere else to call the police. Another thought swirled around in his mind. Moments before, he'd sent a super nerd into the house to call the police under the watchful eye of a murderer. Sending him in alone was a mistake. He released his grip on his jacket and checked his watch. 12 minutes had passed. The second hand seemed to mock him with its steady progress. Each tick was another chance for the killer to destroy evidence, escape, or worse, kill again. He turned to survey the side garden for further clues. The late afternoon light caught on something metallic nestled among the hedge's natural foliage. James pushed his glasses back up the bridge of his nose as he bent down to get a closer look at what was hiding in the leaves. He pushed the dense foliage aside. Branches clung to his sleeve, scratching at his arm as he reached inside. A silver cufflink clung to a branch, engraved with a lion standing on its hind legs. The craftsmanship was impressive. It had individual muscles, strands of mane, and even the tiny indentations for its eyes. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a tissue. His jacket brushed against the tiny leaves as he leaned forward and picked up the cufflink, gripping it with the tissue. It might have been left behind at one of Alistair's parties, the ones featured in the society section of the Tribune's online edition. But he hadn't seen it there earlier, so it belonged to whoever moved Will. A sharp pain shot through James's lower back, forcing him to crouch. He continued to turn the cufflink around in the tissue. The silver was still warm to the touch, the heat detectable, even through the thin barrier of the tissue. Perhaps it had been lost recently because there was no way it would attract the sun, lying under the bushes. Its weight was substantial, possibly speaking to the quality of the metal and its value. Not a costume piece, but something a man of means would wear. Perhaps even an heirloom passed down through generations. But Alistair hadn't worn a collar shirt that would require a cufflink. It seemed familiar, as if he had seen it before, but in a different context. James gasped as an image came to mind. During his final year of college, the French schooling system's equivalent of 9th grade, James took part in a student exchange program with a sister school in Amsterdam. James stayed with a family, and their daughter stayed with his grandparents. To his surprise, her room was filled with cute plush toys and had a pale pink duvet, though the girl had a goth-like appearance. He was forced to sleep in that bed for over a month. The girl's father went to work in a suit, tie and dress shirt with thick cuffs that required cufflinks. His bore the Netherlands coat of arms, which had lions strikingly similar to the cufflink in his hands. Merd. The cufflink's twin had been visible throughout the afternoon, peeking from beneath the crisp white cuff of a tailored shirt. Earlier, Hans had adjusted his sleeves as he poured tea, and James had glimpsed something silver as Hans moved. But was it a lion? It definitely had a rounded top, like the one in his hand, and was made of a similar type of metal. That was too much of a coincidence. This cufflink belonged to someone who had been present when Will's body was discovered, who had access to all areas of the estate, whose movements went unquestioned. It had to be Hans. The groundsman wouldn't have worn cufflinks, nor would Julia, nor the maid. His gaze swept across the ground-level windows. The maid was gone, and there was still no sign of Alistair. He was taking far too long. Something must have gone wrong. James slipped his smartphone out of the inside pocket of his suit jacket. Holding it up in the air, he wandered towards the long beige gravelled drive, where his red Peugeot was parked, watching the words, "No signal." As he whirled towards the southeast direction with his back to the house, the words disappeared, and a single bar materialized. A thick band formed around James's chest as he scrolled through his contacts and found DCI Anwar Khan's number. He struck his index finger against the screen harder than anticipated. Fumbling his phone as it rang, James pulled the phone up to his ear and listened to the dial tone. "What now?" a voice grumbled. "I'm at the Carmichael estate," James said in a hushed tone, hoping that his call would go unnoticed by Hans and the other staff in the stately home. "You're breaking up," Anwar said, cutting him off. His voice crackled in the tiny speaker. James sighed. "I'm at the Carmichael estate. You won't believe this, but I've found a body in the hedges. It's Will Thatcher. I think he's been murdered." "Say that again," Anwar's voice crackled through the speaker. Far off in the distance, James heard the familiar crunch of gravel. Each footfall approached with deliberate heaviness, too measured to be casual, as if they were taking their time and trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. It must be Alistair. "James," Anwar's voice rang in his ear through the speaker of his phone. The footsteps halted momentarily, then resumed with renewed purpose, drawing closer until they were just behind him. A shadow fell across the hedge, stretching over James's hunched form like a shroud. "You won't believe what I found while you were in the house," James said, as he stood and twirled the cufflink between his thumb and forefinger. Chapter 11. Whoosh! The sound registered a fraction of a second before the blur of antique wood materialized in the periphery of James's vision. The smartphone crashed to the ground with a thud as he turned, expecting to see Alistair standing behind him. An intense wave of pain shot through his head as the baseball bat collided with his forehead. The impact rang through his skull like an early morning church bell. As James's spectacles flew off his face and across the gravel, his world plummeted into a bewildering blur of colours and shapes. His arms flailed as he inched closer towards the ground. On his way to meeting the rocks, James squinted. A grey smudge on a white background transformed into a clear image. It was a cufflink engraved with a lion standing on its hind legs, and it was clipped into the crisp white sleeve of his attacker's arm. Moments earlier, he had held its twin in his hands. James groaned as another violent ache, the aftershock from the fall, darted through the back of his skull. Warm liquid trickled down his temple. Its copper scent mingled with the earthy aroma of damp gravel. He had assumed he would die this way, but not so soon. It was the inevitable result of sticking his nose where it didn't belong. The pain intensified, and his vision blurred. Not that it was exceptional, since he'd refused to make time to replace his spectacles. A new prescription was a sign of old age, and James wanted to avoid it for as long as possible. He had become the chief editor stereotype. Glasses, squinting, hunched over and chained to his desk. But not today. The ground spun and his stomach lurched. If it didn't stop soon, he was going to be sick. Tiny stones dug into his back. It was like an acupuncture session gone wrong. an experience he could do without. A few footsteps crunched closer. A tall figure towered over him, probably trying to intimidate him. In the off chance that the surprise attack wasn't enough, the clouds broke and the sun appeared, casting a shadow over his attacker. It was Hans. His wiry frame had morphed into an elongated shadow, and his face was no longer carved from stone but alive with something sharper. Hans didn't say a word. He just stared. "You're going to get caught," James said, slurring his words. "Is that so?" Hans replied. His Dutch accent was more pronounced now, and the carefully cultivated English facade had slipped away. "If I can figure it out, then someone else can," James said as he attempted to stand up on the driveway. But he couldn't. His limbs refused to cooperate, heavy and unresponsive as though they belonged to someone else. "Oh, you mean Lord Carmichael's brat?" Hans shifted the bat to his other hand. Its wood was stained with a smear of crimson at one end. He might be an archaeologist. Hans held up his first 2 fingers on each hand and moved them like quotation marks. But sadly for you, he lacks street smarts. "Merd?" James said as the world around him spun faster than before. The estate's manicured landscape tilted and whirled like a carnival ride gone haywire. "You'll struggle to sell it?" "Of course you think this is all about money. I guess it would be easier for you to think I'm some greedy bastard." Hans's upper lip curled in disgust, revealing teeth clenched in righteous indignation. The leather sole of a polished Oxford dress shoe pressed against James's ribs, the sudden pressure forcing the air from his lungs and cutting off his attempt to shout for help. "I've been working for those rich penny-pinching snobs for years, dusting their precious artifacts, serving their expensive teas, watching them drape themselves in the cultural heritage of nations they once colonized." Hans's voice trembled with decades of pent-up resentment. "The second I was about to receive some good fortune, you and the other fellow got in my way." "So it is about the money," James winced in pain. Each word sent fresh spikes of agony through his battered skull. "I'm taking the painting back to where it belongs. I hired professional art handlers from Rotterdam, who were far too young to ask the right questions. They loaded the painting and left. I even managed to throw that nosy Parker into the hedges while Julia made them tea. They were clueless," Hans said. James felt the shoe dig a little deeper into his side. The pressure increased until it was hard to breathe. "It belongs to the people of the Netherlands, not lining the walls of this godforsaken place. My grandfather watched the Nazis plunder Rotterdam's museums. Did you know that?" Hans's eyes glazed with the distant look of someone seeing beyond the present moment. "I'm tired of seeing national treasures hanging in museums and private galleries. Artifacts like the Van Gogh belong to the country of origin. Still, museums and private collectors refuse to return them to their rightful places." Hans let out a bitter chuckle. "The great irony is that Van Gogh died penniless and unappreciated. Now this lot trades his suffering like stocks." A deep sense of fear built up within James as the edges of his blurred vision blackened. Then the world around him darkened as his eyelids closed. Chapter 12. Tuesday, 3:59 p.m. A strong, antiseptic-like aroma, followed by the distant beep of something mechanical, seeped into James's dream. Then a dull throb from the back of his head filtered through. From above, an unforgiving glow pressed against his eyelids. It was as if he were in a hospital. But that can't be right. This, too, must be a dream. But he couldn't lie here forever. He had to get up. If anything, he was going to be late for his morning editorial meeting with his staff. On Friday night, as Will Thatcher had left, James had a feeling that he would try to wiggle out of his interview with the Carmichael guy. What was his name again? "James?" Valentine's voice floated towards him. It was gentle, but it was tinged with that particular cadence of worry he had heard many times before. He must be running late after all. Her icy fingers interlaced with his own. A sharp pain shot into his left hand as she squeezed it. Just 5 more minutes, that's all he wanted. Admitting defeat, he opened his eyes and tried to focus on her face, but the world refused to settle into proper clarity. He was in the hospital after all. Eventually, Valentine appeared as a watercolour version of herself, with all her familiar features, but blurred at the edges. Her long blonde hair fell around her shoulders, catching the harsh overhead light, and softening it somehow. Though the slight furrow between her brows betrayed her concern, her delicate features remained composed. She wore that striped cardigan, which had always confused him. It had an exorbitant price tag and a riot of colours that clashed with everything. He was sure it was a social experiment. "It's okay. You're in the Northampton General Hospital," she murmured, reaching for a plastic cup on the side table. Leaning forward, she rested the edge of the cup against his chapped lips. The cool water slipped down his dry throat. He felt like a man marooned in a desert who had just discovered water after days of wandering. "You've been unconscious for a little over 24 hours. Beyond Valentine's shoulder, the Northampton Tribune lay on a wheeled-over bed tray. James squinted, making out a large black-and-white photo of a limestone facade of a stately home. That place looked familiar, as if it were from some distant event buried in his memory from long ago. At the top of the page, the headline read, "Butler Arrested in Art Nationalism Plot." James leaned back on the pillow and closed his eyes as the room spun. He didn't remember editing that. Maybe Will wrote it. How did he end up in here? Why couldn't he remember the article? Perhaps he fell asleep while driving. He had almost done that a couple of times. James closed his eyes and let out a sigh. There was a part of him that needed to ask, but he knew better than to bring up work. Of late, conversations about the Tribune ended in a fight, almost every time. This time, things might end differently. It was official. He had become an optimist. That was a fascinating development. What day is it? Did I miss the editorial meeting? James opened his eyes just in time to see the flash of anger across Valentine's face, but it vanished. It was something he had never seen before. Usually she would snap at him. And who edited that article? Was it Will? Her lower lip quivered as tears welled up in her pale green eyes. "Your doctors told me that you have a concussion, and not to bombard you with information. Just rest. Everything has been taken care of. All you have to do right now is rest." Without saying anything more, Valentine rose and left his private room, slipping into the brightly lit corridor. The door closed behind her with a soft click. His eyelids grew heavy, and his eyeballs ached like he'd been staring at a screen without his glasses for hours. A part of him wanted to jump out of bed and dash across the room towards the newspaper and read. He needed to know, but the dull pain in his body was telling him a different story. On top of that, his limbs seemed as if they were anchored to the bed, like cement weights. He was exhausted, even though he had probably been sleeping for hours. Epilogue. The neurologist's office at Northampton General Hospital was a study in organised chaos. Diplomas in heavy frames hung on the wall behind Dr. Archibald Harmon's desk, and towers of paper were perched around the room like watchmen at a museum, guarding his authority in matters of the brain. This was going to be a long and difficult chat. Throughout the last 6 hours, James had woken up asking the same questions over and over again. It was like he was stuck in a loop. But his personality remained intact. That was a good sign. Valentine sat on the edge of a faux leather chair. It was a mystery how anyone could get work done surrounded by such a mess. In the background, the air conditioner hummed, serving a temperature that only a freezer could envy. She hunched forward, pulling the edges of her cardigan together, and shivered. Its stripes were the only splash of colour in a room dominated by clinical whites, beiges, and mahogany. "Retrograde amnesia is quite common with traumatic head injuries," Dr. Harmon said as his grey moustache twitched. He drummed his fingers against James's thick medical file, the beat in tune with the wall clock's methodical ticking. The hours surrounding the trauma often become what we call a black spot in memory, but in James's case, the spot is an entire day. Valentine nodded. The information washed over her like a cold shower on an early winter's morning. On Dr. Harmon's monitor was James's latest brain scan rendered in a clinical grayscale. Each variation seemed the same to her. What does that mean for James? Will he remember what happened at the Carmichael estate? Dr. Harmon collapsed back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His eyes, kind but professional. They met hers above the reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. That's the silver lining with a concussion. He may never remember the event, and it was a pretty traumatic one. But as I've learned from his file, James is no stranger to trauma, he said in a matter-of-fact tone. As you've just mentioned, he's woken up for the 4th time and is still asking the same questions. Eventually he should start recognizing his surroundings and make memories. But we have to be patient. An icy breeze from the air conditioner caused the hairs on the left side of her neck to stand on end. Her pale blonde hair fell past her shoulders and around the right side of her neck, almost touching her waist. Does that mean it's okay to talk to him about what happened at the Carmichael estate? DCI Anwar Khan and PC David Chan are keen to discuss it with him. Valentine twirled the ends of her hair with her finger. On the other side of the desk, Dr. Harmon slumped back in his chair as his moustache twitched at the mention of the police. I won't overwhelm you with the science, because it's not... He waved his hands in the air as if he was struggling to come up with the right words. So black and white. Nevertheless, when someone has retrograde amnesia, they can be more open to suggestion than normal. He cleared his throat. For instance, if you or the police were to pressure James to remember, he might unintentionally fill in memory gaps with made-up or distorted details. Valentine bit the inside of her lower lip. Her boyfriend was finally open to suggestion, but she doubted she could convince him to take a romantic vacation or spend less time at work. This was not how she expected to spend her late 20s. She wanted to travel and have fun, but she was trapped in Northampton with a man who was happy to bury himself alive in work. That's all he wanted to do. He was married to that job, and she hated it. Miss Charley? He leaned over the desk, his eyes narrowed as if he was concerned about her behaviour. She smiled back at him. Sorry, I'm just tired. Valentine shrugged her right shoulder. So does that mean Anwar and David Chan won't be stopping by for a third time? I've explained to them that he isn't capable of being a reliable witness, especially if there was a court case. He reached under the desktop, opened a drawer and fumbled around. A few moments later, he pulled out today's edition of the Northampton Tribune. Just like his office, the newspaper was also chaotic. Its corners were folded back at irregular angles. Sections were displaced from their proper sequence, and the business pages were wedged between local news and sports. Its once crisp folds had softened into a series of wrinkles and creases that had been consulted too many times. He must secretly read it during his downtime. Then it dawned on her. He probably read it on the toilet like every other man. Why was that an appealing pastime for men? She didn't get it, and if she were honest, she didn't want to understand. It was something she would rather remain a mystery. He held the paper up in the air and waved it. According to the front page, there's no mention of the Van Gogh's whereabouts. Valentine resisted the urge to roll her eyes. It was a habit that she had picked up from James. I'm pretty sure they know where it is, but the police are being tight-lipped about it. During Anwar's first attempt at visiting James, he received a call from Interpol. I think he was hoping to trade the information with me if I let him speak with James. Valentine shifted in the chair. Can I tell him about Will? I know earlier you said that I couldn't. Dr. Harmon set the newspaper down. No, you shouldn't try to jog his memory. It's better to wait until his condition is more stable and see what he remembers on his own. So I have to redirect the conversation every time he asks. Or worse, lie to him. He's going to get suspicious. Consider it a medical necessity rather than lying. Dr. Harmon took off his glasses and rubbed them against his button-down shirt. He can't handle any additional trauma without risk of further complications. Valentine nodded. So this was her new reality, dodging her boyfriend's endless questions. Yesterday, James had left their maisonette at 7 a.m. with his usual distracted kiss, his mind focused on other things that he never shared with her. Now she sat discussing memory confabulation with a neurologist while DCI Anwar Khan was lurking in the hospital's corridors for a third time, hoping to extract information about a painting that had cost Will Thatcher his life. But the police will continue to press him, she let out an exasperated sigh. Also, Anwar and James are friends. They will talk at some point. I can't stop them. Trust me, I've tried. The DCI will listen to me. I've made sure he understands. I've worked with him before, and he has listened to my guidance in the past. He knows that James has nothing to offer their investigation but unreliable fragments. He checked his watch, a not-so-subtle sign that the conversation had reached its inevitable end. Valentine rose from her chair. I need to do an MRI and a few standard tests before I can release him, Dr. Harmon said as she reached the door. Don't worry, you'll be able to take him home within the next 24 to 48 hours. The corridor stretched before her. Somewhere within these walls, James waited with his fractured memories. He would have millions of questions she couldn't answer. Beyond the hospital in the city's centre was Will's empty desk on the Tribune's newsroom floor. It would remain as he'd left it the previous Friday. his unwashed coffee mug would still be sitting by his computer, waiting, never to be drunk out of again. A half-written story, open on his computer, was a task that someone else would have to finish. Those ancient sticky notes he placed haphazardly around his screen would still be flapping in the cool breeze of the Tribune's overworked air conditioner, and the world would continue with its cold efficiency in the face of his absence. Thank you for listening to The Last Exhibit, a gripping murder mystery novella set on an English country estate, written by A.D. Hay, read to you by Christopher, an AI synthetic male voice. Copyright 2026. All rights reserved.